What precedents are there? We can use Stern nicely now. This is Stern said, annual reductions are greater than 1% per annum have only ever been associated with economic recession or upheaval. So perhaps what we're going through now is exactly this. The UK had this switch, the dash for gas, when we built lots of gas-fired power stations and basically substituted a large number of coal stations. It was a radical shift in our electricity generation system in the UK. The French had a far bigger shift towards nuclear power, 40-fold increase. And remember, the French electricity system supplies a lot of their transport as well, as ours doesn't. Electricity in the UK is only 18% of what we consume. 82% is not electricity. It's not the same in France. A lot of it, I think it's about a third of their energy comes from electricity. So they have a massive nuclear programme. And yet you only saw 1% per annum reductions in emissions from both of these countries during these shifts to low carbon fuels. And that excludes aviation and shipping. If you factor these in, these are the only historical precedents, other than one, which I'll show you in a minute, of ever moving towards low carbon futures, and we didn't succeed. All we managed to do was stabilise emissions whilst we spent a fortune doing this. But there is a great example out there, fortunately, the collapse of the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union was 5% per annum reductions, and it went on for about 10 years. If we could achieve greater than that by 2015 across the OECD countries, then we might have some hope of 550 degrees, 550 ppmv. We'd have to be looking at those, 650 ppmv. So for 4 degrees C, if we could persuade the wealthy nations of the world to have their energy consumption go down the same rate as was associated with the Soviet Union economy, we might have some hope at 4 degrees C. So when you ally the science and the emissions data, it just points in an absolutely, completely the wrong direction. And you think, well, you put on top of all this the feedbacks issues. But people ask me, what would you do for adaptation for 4 degrees C? I think probably what we'd do is we'd arm and build high walls. I don't think there are adaptation processes for 4 degrees C. I think it's pretty much the collapse of everything that we know. So where does this leave us? Well, even if we have an unprecedented step change in mitigating emissions, 650 looks about the best we can possibly expect at the moment. All the data in here is taken from standard government sources. The modelling data is taken out of IPCC, some little bits and pieces taken out of Hadley, economics is taken out of Stern. These are all your conventional sources. All we are people that crank a mathematical handle, so it's quite simple stuff that we do. We're just a messenger putting together the data that's out there, and that's what it tends to point towards. That's not a nice message, people don't like to hear it, but that's where we seem to be heading. So 4 degrees C. Our argument therefore is we need to reframe climate change. We still think mitigation should drive towards 2 degrees C. Personally, I think it should drive lower than that. So whatever is necessary to get mitigation at 2 degrees C. But at the same time, if you adapt to 2 degrees C, that's a disaster. You've got to adapt to something well above that. Now, what that might look like at the moment, I have no idea. But I think if you redid your drivers, you'd mitigate for 2 and adapt for 4. And this would fundamentally change what it is that we do in terms of building infrastructure in the OECD countries. And of course, whole new cities are evolving and developing in other parts of the world. So I think we should be looking at those as our drivers. Now let's just bring this back to the UK. This is slightly older work, which is partially updated, but it still gives the same sort of sense to it anyway. 2 to 3 degrees C for the UK, that's the cumulative values. Now what we've done here, we've used the approach the government used to come up with a 60% target, which is basically they use contraction and convergence. If you follow the history back, the 60% target came out of the Royal Commission report. The Royal Commission report explicitly referred to contraction and convergence. The government had never explicitly referred to it, but they have taken the target from that report. So the government effectively has used contraction and convergence. If you use that for the global numbers in AR4, you get that number for the UK. 2 questions from that arise, that we're not in 2000 anymore. That was an obvious question, isn't it? But Stern didn't realise that, and nor did the Climate Change Bill. They don't take the data in 2000s, and that's because the data is so awful. The emissions have just gone up and up, so we can't do that, so we can't deal with it. So we pretend we're in 2000. And also something about what we're doing, what we can do for the next few years. Well, since 2000 to 2006, according to the government, we've emitted 4.5 billion tonnes of CO2 from the UK. That's a quarter of our 50-year budget in 6 years. And my guess is even this year will probably be more emissions than last year, though the recession again might start to have some other impacts. So that's the rate at which we're using them up. And it's not too surprising, we just look at our own lifestyles. We're emitting more carbon, I would think, every single year. I work in the climate change community, and they're the worst people in the world for carbon footprints. And the thing is, we still laugh about it. I find that's what I'm most disturbing, because this is violence on other people. And I'm concerned now that we've not got past the humour part to start to say this is actually a serious issue, that we're pumping the CO2 to claim to do something about the climate, rather than actually showing any leadership ourselves. Let's look at the second answer graphically. there's the emissions. As you see, an interesting point here, which makes, I think, it's quite a, well, it's the only real evidence of what you might need to do to deal with climate change or deal with emissions. That's the data from 2000 to 2006 with a little dip in it. That dip is the only climate change policy that's worked in the UK or globally, and it was September the 11th. That wasn't a judicious climate change policy, but the reason that had an impact is quite simple. It got the consumption down. And consumption and emissions are completely hand in hand at the moment. There is no break in those. The only argument we ever make for a break is our emissions our carbon intensity is lower in the UK unit of GDP because we buy in the goods that require the carbon from China and India and elsewhere. Actually, our consumption is still just linked completely with CO2. So unless we start to break those, and it's only when the emissions seem to go that consumption goes down, do you actually start to see some real reductions in CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. We haven't managed to break that yet. So again, as we say, the recession might be an interesting period, but it will be interesting when we plot the data as to what happens to the emissions during the recession. I would guess that they will drop significantly, or at least maybe stabilise out. So let's assume over the next 6 years that we stabilise emissions from all sectors in the UK, from cars, houses, buildings, universities, everything else, except for aviation and shipping, they still go up. We have them going up here by lower than the current growth rate. Though I haven't said that the current growth rate may well have been affected just recently. But you'd end up with a number, something like that, a line, something like that. It could be a bit higher, it could be a bit lower, but it would be somewhere around about that. Now we know what we have in the bank. We know what we can emit between 2000 and 2050. That's our amount there, and that's the range. So if you then plotted that for the next 2 decades, this is data we haven't just readjusted this, that would mean that we would have to have 6 to 9% reductions in UK's emissions, starting from sometime 2012, 2015, that sort of period. 6 to 9% reductions year on year for us to make our fair contribution towards a 50-50 chance of avoiding 2 degrees C. And this is the best bit. I mean, we've got the climate change bill, which is sort of putting us, well, it's not nowhere near this sort of target, but it's at least moving in the right direction. And that's the best bit of legislation there is worldwide. There's nothing to touch the climate change bill at the moment. And it is completely inadequate to bring about those sort of levels of changes. So the best bit of legislation in the world that will be applied, hopefully, to one small country is completely inadequate to make any dent in 2 degrees C. And remember, you can't ratchet up in the future. You can't say, well, it'll get better in the future, because it's a cumulative issue. You can't say, well, we'll start to get it really good about it here, because it's just too late. So this is an optimistic slide. I gave a talk today, so I said I've got to have an optimistic slide in there. So this is the optimistic bit. Firstly, it tells us something about policies for OECD-type countries. Now, I think there's a big shift to go OECD and non-OECD. You get opposite sort of generalised policy suggestions. Now, most of the emissions are going to come over the next 15 years. And the next 15 years, it doesn't matter what you do on nuclear power, offshore wind turbines, all those wonderful things, they'll make almost no difference to emissions in the UK. They might change the rate of growth of emissions a little bit, but that's all they'll do. Because you can't get enough out there. You won't get 30 nuclear power stations by 2020. You won't get hundreds of thousands of offshore wind turbines. You will get a few thousand. You won't make anything to make a dent. Remember, electricity is what we're really aiming at here. It's only 18% of our energy consumption. So the only game in town over that period is demand. And that comes back down to us, as well as government. It's behavioural demand, and it's actually making technology changes to more appropriate technologies. So if we do something on demand as a matter of extreme urgency, we need to ally that then with issues of supply. So supply is still hugely important, but you've got to start coming down this curve. Because your nuclear power stations, your offshore wind turbines, wherever it might be, your third, fourth generation biofuels, are all over here somewhere. So you need to have done this through demand, and then you use your supply and demand still to carry on bringing you down the curve. Now that's quite different, I think, for the non-OECD countries, because they don't have demand like we do. Their demand's going up, and yes, they should do something about demand as much as they reasonably can, but the demand needs to keep going up for welfare issues generally. So what they need is low carbon supply. So in the wealthy parts of the world, it's about demand, and supply is not so important. In the less wealthy parts, it's about supply, and demand is slightly less important. They're quite a different message, really. I mean, that's simplifying it to 2 parts of the world, but it was just some sort of picture.